Hello there. Let's have a little chat about a sector of the economy that has somehow managed to stay under the radar and not get all that much mention during the election campaign, which is both kind of weird and kind of not surprising when we actually think about it. And full disclosure here, this is kind of going to turn into a little bit of a sales pitch for my next project, and I'm hoping you might be able to help me out with it. The sector that I'm talking about here is the creative sector, and it's absolutely massive, but also kind of problematic. It's massive in that some parts of the sector, like the screen industry, bring as much money into our GDP as forestry does each year. But it's also kind of problematic in that film is kind of the only part of the creative sector that can be measured in dollar outcomes. The rest of it isn't measured that way, and the outcome is completely different depending on the medium that you're working in or what the output is. And this is part of the problem when you're trying to run an economic based campaign for an election. When you try and tell people that something like the creative sector, where they don't see something physically come out of it all the time, is something that you want to prioritize funding on. It just didn't happen. And when people are at home making the choice between petrol in the car or food on the table, it's understandable that something like the creative sector becomes a bit of a target that you don't want people to talk about so much or focus on. And when it came to this particular campaign, well, there were some serious issues with the policies around the creative sector. You see, the three parties that are looking at making up the government were really thin on the ground in terms of creative sector policies. In fact, only one of them actually had a policy for the creative sector. The National Party said that they didn't have the bandwidth to deal with it before the election, so they didn't have a policy in place. New Zealand First have more written on their Facebook and web pages about penis police in bathrooms than they do about the creative sector, with absolutely no policy there, despite some really creative writing in their policy writing itself. That's right, ACT is the only one of the potential coalition partners that have any kind of policy on creativity. And I'm sure for a party that seems to think that hate speech is fine because it's free speech, unless it comes from a poet who's a person of color writing about the issues of colonization and its long term effects, that then apparently is hate speech that isn't allowed. I'm sure you can tell that their policy is going to be absolutely brilliant. They want to tie funding for the creative sector to two very different factors. One is potential ticket sales, which is not necessarily going to work for everybody. The other is how much philanthropists are willing to give to that sector. And nothing ever goes wrong when you rely on philanthropy to fund the creative sector. It's not like anybody would ever go out of their way to manipulate that particular issue, is it? So, for the next 3 years, things are going to be really tough for the creative sector in general. Oh boy, which is one of the reasons why I've set up this new project. It's a Kickstarter campaign that I'm working on because I want to make a feature film. I've mentioned it a few times. And the Kickstarter went live yesterday. There's a link in my link tree, it's the top one. Feel free to go along and have a look at it. Because funding for things like films made locally telling local stories is going to dry up really fast under whatever the makeup is of this next coalition government. And it takes years for the creative sector to recover from that lack of resources. But the thing to remember about anywhere in the creative sector is that the results we get aren't ticket sales and they aren't basic numbers. It's about what you get on an emotional level, what you get on a psychological level, what you get to tell you how to feel and think and react and how other people process things. And we need to remember that going into any kind of creative sector discussion, particularly in the next few years when it's going to be really tough for them.